It was a sunny Saturday morning when I first broke ground on my garden. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for planting. I spent weeks planning it out, poring over gardening books, and watching countless YouTube videos. My husband, Mark, thought I was crazy, spending so much time out there. But he couldn't argue with the fresh veggies I started bringing to the dinner table. Every morning, I'd wake up early just to spend a few minutes in my little slice of paradise. The vibrant colors, the sweet smell of flowers, the earthy scent of tomato plants. It was pure bliss. I'd run my fingers through the soft soil, feeling connected to something bigger than myself. But then, one day, I noticed a shadow at the edge of my garden. At first, I thought it was someone admiring from afar, so I waved and smiled, ready to show off my pride and joy. As I got closer, I saw a tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair that didn't move an inch in the breeze. Her clothes looked expensive, and the look on her face was anything but friendly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Are you aware that this mess is a violation of our HOA rules?" I blinked, caught off guard. HOA rules? I vaguely remembered signing some papers when we bought the house, but I hadn't given them much thought. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "I'm not sure what you mean. This is just my garden." She let out a dramatic sigh. "This is not a garden," she said, gesturing at my beautiful plants. "This is an eyesore. It's bringing down property values in the entire neighborhood." I felt my face getting hot. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. My garden is well maintained." She cut me off. "I am Margaret Hargrove, president of the Homeowners Association, and I'm telling you this simply won't do. You have 1 week to remove all of this and replace it with proper landscaping, or you'll be hearing from our lawyers." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me standing there, mouth hanging open in shock. I looked back at my garden, my beautiful, thriving garden, and felt a knot form in my stomach. This couldn't be happening. Not to my little piece of heaven. I thought that would be the end of it. Just some busybody with nothing better to do than hassle her neighbors. Boy, was I wrong. The next day, I woke up to find a bright orange sticker slapped on my mailbox. "Violation," it screamed in bold letters. What could I have possibly done now? As I stood there, coffee mug in hand and still in my pajamas, I heard the click-clack of high heels on the sidewalk. I turned to see Margaret Hargrove striding toward me, clipboard in hand, and a look of determination on her face that would make a drill sergeant proud. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation from yesterday." I blinked, still half asleep. "Conversation? You mean when you told me my garden was against the rules?" Margaret's smile tightened. "Precisely. Now, I've taken the liberty of drafting up an official notice for you." She thrust a piece of paper into my hands. I scanned the document, my eyes widening with each ridiculous line. My garden violated 3 HOA bylaws. Unapproved landscape alteration, failing to maintain aesthetic harmony, and, wait for it, encouraging wildlife intrusion. Wildlife intrusion? I sputtered. "It's a vegetable garden, not a petting zoo." "What's next? Finding people for bird feeders because they're running an unauthorized avian resort?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Vegetables attract rabbits, Mrs. Thompson. Do you want to be responsible for a rabbit infestation in our community?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Listen, Margaret, I've lived here for 5 years. I've never heard of these rules before. Can you show me where it says I can't have a vegetable garden?" She clutched her clipboard to her chest. "The bylaws clearly state that all landscaping changes must be approved by the HOA board. Did you submit a request form?" I hadn't, of course. "No, but..." "Then you're in violation." Margaret cut me off. "You have 7 days to remove the garden and restore your yard, or you'll face daily fines starting at $50. My jaw dropped. Daily fines for growing vegetables? As Margaret click-clacked away, I stood there holding that stupid piece of paper, wondering how my little garden could cause so much trouble. I looked back at my thriving plants, the thought of tearing it all out making my heart ache. "Don't let her push you around, Sarah." I turned to see my neighbor, Tom, watering his lawn. "That garden of yours is the best thing on the block. We've got your back." His words gave me strength. I wasn't about to give up without a fight. If Margaret wanted a war over veggies, she was going to get one. I stormed back into the house, fired up my computer, and started digging into those HOA bylaws. There had to be a loophole, something I could use to save my garden. I thought I'd seen the worst of Margaret's antics, but boy, was I wrong. The next week felt like I was living in some bizarre gardening-themed reality show. Margaret seemed to materialize out of thin air every time I stepped outside, iPhone in hand, snapping pictures like she was documenting evidence for a crime scene. One sunny afternoon, I was pruning my cucumber vines when I noticed a flash of movement near the fence. I peeked over and nearly fell over laughing. There was Margaret, ruler in hand, stretching up on her tiptoes to measure my cherry tomato plants. I couldn't help myself. "Need some fertilizer for your ruler, Margaret?" I called out. She jumped like a startled cat and scurried away without a word. But Margaret wasn't done. A few days later, I came home to find my neighbors clutching glossy pamphlets. Margaret had gone full door-to-door saleswoman, handing out garden violation awareness flyers. These masterpieces featured a photo of my garden with a big red X through it, alongside pictures of perfectly manicured lawns. The text warned about the dangerous precedent my veggie patch was setting. I had to admit, I was almost impressed by her dedication. Things took a turn for the truly bizarre when Margaret set her sights on my sunflowers. "Those sunflowers are a threat to property values," she shrieked from her driveway. "They're too tall. They're blocking the view." I looked around, puzzled. The only thing those sunflowers were blocking was Margaret's view of my tomatoes, which she seemed unnaturally obsessed with. I tried reasoning with her one morning. I caught her power walking past my house and decided to extend an olive branch. "Margaret," I said, jogging to catch up with her, "did you know that gardens can actually increase property values? Studies show they can boost home prices by up to 7.7%. She didn't even break her stride, just huffed and puffed away like I was invisible. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Margaret outdid herself. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I was in the backyard harvesting some zucchini when I heard sirens. I peeked around the side of the house and saw a patrol car pulling up. Margaret was there, pointing dramatically at my garden like she was reenacting a scene from a bad cop show. Two officers approached, looking confused. "Ma'am," one of them said, trying to keep a straight face, "we received a call about suspicious plants." I burst out laughing. "Officers," I managed to say between giggles, "would you like a tour of my criminal vegetable empire?" The younger cop cracked a smile and turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, can you point out exactly which plants you believe are illegal?" Margaret sputtered and pointed at my zucchini plants. "Those. They're too big to be legal vegetables." The officers exchanged glances, clearly struggling not to laugh. The older cop cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I can assure you there's no law against large zucchini." As they were leaving, the younger officer paused. "Say, those tomatoes look mighty fine. Any chance you might spare one for a hardworking public servant?" I happily obliged, sending them off with a bag of veggies. Margaret stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as the patrol car drove away. You'd think having the police laugh off her complaints would make Margaret rethink her anti-garden vendetta. Fat chance. As I watched her storm back to her house, I had no idea of the sneaky, underhanded tactics she was about to unleash. Let's just say my security camera was about to earn its keep. The next morning, I woke up to find a stack of flyers on my porch. "Attention neighbors, pest infestation alert," the headline screamed in big red letters. Margaret's expert analysis claimed my garden was a breeding ground for every bug imaginable, including made-up ones like zucchini weevils. Over the next few days, my front door became a bulletin board for Margaret's passive-aggressive notes. "Your weeds are showing," one said. Another informed me that my tomatoes were visually disruptive due to their excessive redness. Things got even crazier when Margaret tried to claim my garden was a structure needing HOA approval. I got a formal letter stating my vegetable-based edifice violated building codes. Was she seriously arguing my tomato plants needed a building permit? One afternoon, I caught Margaret red-handed sprinkling weed killer in my garden beds. I confronted her, and she tried to pass it off as fertilizer. I grabbed the bottle and threatened to call the police if she came near my garden again. That's when I installed the security camera. Over the next week, it caught Margaret in more sneaky acts than a spy movie. She'd wait until I left for work, then come snooping around with a ruler and notebook. One day, she spent an hour measuring my sunflowers, probably hoping they'd grown an illegal inch overnight. But Margaret's crusade hit its peak when she tried to get my mail delivery stopped, claiming my plants were obstructing the path to my mailbox. I was chatting with Mike, our mailman, when he mentioned her complaint. "You know," Mike said, shaking his head, "in all my years on this route, I've never seen anyone go to such lengths over a few tomato plants. What's her deal, anyway?" I shrugged. "Honestly, Mike, I'm starting to wonder if Margaret has some kind of personal vendetta against vegetables. Maybe she got scared by a cucumber as a child or something." As amusing as it was to joke about Margaret's vegetable vendetta, the constant harassment was starting to wear on me. There were days when I wanted nothing more than to march over to her perfectly manicured lawn and give her a piece of my mind. But I knew that's exactly what she wanted, to see me lose my cool and prove that I was the neighborhood menace she claimed I was. Instead, I decided to take the high road. Every time Margaret glared at me from across the street, I'd plaster on my brightest smile and wave like we were long-lost friends. The look of confusion on her face was priceless. When she left another one of her ridiculous violation notices on my door, I'd respond with a cheerful thank you card. "Dear Margaret, thanks so much for your concern about my garden. The zucchini are coming in nicely. Would you like some?" I even started inviting her over for tea and cucumber sandwiches, fresh from the garden. I'd call out as she speed-walked past my house. She never accepted, of course, but I could tell it was driving her nuts. How could she keep painting me as the neighborhood villain when I was being so darn nice? One afternoon, I was out watering my tomatoes when I saw Margaret on her phone, gesturing wildly toward my yard. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up. I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing as I watched Margaret practically drag the poor officer over to my criminal garden. "Officer," I said with a big smile, "would you like a tour of the crime scene? I promise there are no zucchini weevils in sight." The cop looked confused, but he played along. As we walked through the rows of vegetables, I couldn't help but notice him eyeing my cherry tomatoes. "Those look delicious," he said almost sheepishly. "Please, take some," I insisted, handing him a paper bag. "I've got more than I know what to do with." As he left with his bag of evidence, I caught Margaret's eye. If looks could kill, I'd have been fertilizer for next year's crop. To be honest, keeping my cool wasn't always easy. There were nights when I'd lie awake, my stomach in knots, replaying Margaret's latest stunt in my head. But then I'd remind myself that getting angry would only give her more ammunition. Plus, there was something oddly satisfying about killing her with kindness. I even started having a little fun with it. Remember that gnarly tomato plant that looked like it had been through a war? I named it Margaret. Every time I watered it, I'd say, "Looking lovely today, Margaret," loud enough for the real Margaret to hear if she happened to be lurking nearby. Through it all, I kept gardening. I wasn't about to let Margaret's crusade ruin something I loved so much. If anything, her antics made me even more determined. I planted more flowers, experimented with new vegetables, and spent every spare moment tending to my little slice of paradise. Margaret's persistence was like a stubborn weed. The more you tried to get rid of it, the stronger it seemed to grow. But so was my resolve. The best part? My garden was thriving. Despite Margaret's dire warnings about pest infestations and property value plummets, my yard had never looked better. The sunflowers were taller than ever. The zucchini were still comically large, and I swear my tomatoes were sweeter just to spite her. While my garden was thriving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Margaret's crusade against my veggies seemed a little too personal, a little too made up. I decided it was time to dig into the real dirt, the HOA rule book. Getting my hands on that thing was no easy task. After days of sweet-talking Marge at the community center, she finally caved. When she handed it over, I nearly toppled backward. This rule book was thicker than my grandma's old family Bible and about as exciting as watching paint dry. But I was on a mission. Night after night, I pored over that monster, armed with a highlighter and more coffee than any human should consume. My husband thought I'd lost it. "Honey," he'd say, peeking into our home office at 2 a.m., "you know normal people are sleeping right now, right?" I'd just grunt and keep flipping pages. You wouldn't believe the stuff I found in there. Rules about everything. The acceptable height of your fence, down to the quarter inch. The exact shade of beige your mailbox had to be, you bet. And even a section on what kind of Christmas lights you could use, spoiler alert. No blinking allowed. Sorry, Griswolds. But here's the kicker. Not a single word about vegetable gardens. Not one measly mention. I read that thing cover to cover, then backward, then upside down just in case. Nada. Zip. Zilch. In fact, there was a whole section encouraging beautification of personal property. It went on about how homeowners should enhance the visual appeal of their yards. Last I checked, my zucchini were a lot prettier than Margaret's wilting petunias. I couldn't believe it. I called my buddy Jake, who happens to be a lawyer. He came over, read through the rule book, and confirmed. Emily, there's absolutely nothing in here about vegetable gardens being against the rules. Your HOA president's been taking you for a ride. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. All this time, all that stress, all those confrontations, and Margaret had been making up rules. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both, probably looking like a complete lunatic to poor Jake. Once the shock wore off, I realized what this meant. I had ammunition now, real, solid proof that Margaret was full of hot air. It was time to plan my counterattack. I spent the next few days strategizing. Should I confront Margaret directly, or go bigger? Expose her lies to the whole neighborhood? In the end, I decided to play it cool. I'd wait for the next HOA meeting and drop my bombshell there. Let Margaret dig her own grave in front of everyone. As I plotted my move, I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, planning a takedown over some tomatoes and zucchini. But it wasn't just about the veggies anymore. It was about standing up to a bully, about fighting for what's right. And boy, was I ready for a fight. Just when I thought this whole garden fiasco couldn't get any crazier, the plot thickened faster than my grandma's famous gravy. My little vegetable patch had become a symbol of something bigger, and I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The next few days gave Neighborhood Watch a whole new meaning. It started with Mrs. Johnson from next door bringing a steaming apple pie and support for my tomatoes. Then the floodgates opened. The Smiths offered to be witnesses against Margaret's yard skulking. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson grumbled that he'd rather look at my garden than Margaret's sour face. Soon, I was finding encouraging notes in my mailbox. Keep growing. And don't let the HOA get you down. One neighbor, a retired lawyer, wrote a passionate defense of my garden as a clear victory for common sense and human decency. The support bloomed like a well-tended garden. I woke up one morning to find kids putting up a colorful sign. Save the tomatoes. They cheered like I was some veggie-growing superhero. Margaret, driving by later, looked like she'd swallowed a particularly sour lemon. Word spread beyond our cul-de-sac. The local garden club offered to inspect my yard and write a formal letter of approval. I couldn't help but grin, imagining Margaret's face if a bunch of master gardeners showed up to defend my zucchinis. As my team of supporters grew, we started to strategize. We gathered in my backyard, surrounded by the contentious veggies, to plan our next moves. Mrs. Johnson suggested a neighborhood potluck featuring dishes made from homegrown produce. The Smiths proposed documenting Margaret's investigations to build a case against harassment. Mr. Peterson, in a rare moment of enthusiasm, declared he'd start his own garden in solidarity. Let's see her try to take on the whole street, he said with a glimmer in his eye. As we sat there, surrounded by thriving plants and determined neighbors, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It wasn't even about Margaret and her crusade. It was about standing up to unfair rules and refusing to let someone bully us into submission. My little vegetable patch had sprouted into a full-blown rebellion, with roots spreading through the entire neighborhood. The garden uprising of Willow Lane was in full bloom, and I couldn't wait to see what would grow next. The day of the HOA meeting was looming, and I knew I had to bring my A-game. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about standing up to unfair rules and showing Margaret that she couldn't bully us into submission. I was determined to make my case, and I wasn't going to let a little thing like nerves get in my way. I decided to make a PowerPoint presentation. I spent hours putting together slides with before and after photos of my garden, including shots of my giant zucchini. I highlighted every relevant section in the HOA rule book, turning it into a rainbow-colored mess. Mrs. Johnson agreed to speak on my behalf and promised to bring one of her famous apple pies. I also created a photo album of my veggies, titled Exhibit A, The Crimes of the Thompson Garden, with captions like Dangerous Tomato, Approach with Caution, and Lethal Lettuce, not for the faint of heart. The night before the big showdown, I practiced my speech in front of Mr. Whiskers, my cat. He seemed unimpressed, but I kept going, trying to anticipate Margaret's arguments. As I rehearsed, my hands got sweaty and my voice shaky. I imagined worst-case scenarios, tripping over my own feet as I walked in, my PowerPoint slides mysteriously disappearing, or Margaret showing up with an army of lawyers. I tossed and turned all night, my mind racing. What if Margaret had some trick up her sleeve? What if the other HOA members sided with her? I pictured myself stuttering through my presentation while Margaret smirked triumphantly. Or worse, what if I got so nervous I accidentally called her Your Majesty instead of Madam President? But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, the neighbors who'd supported me, the kids who'd made that adorable Save the Tomato sign, even grumpy old Mr. Peterson, who'd actually cracked a smile when I gave him some fresh cucumbers. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, losing sleep over a bunch of tomato plants and zucchinis. But you know what? It felt good. It felt right. I was standing up for something I believed in, even if that something was just my little backyard garden. And come tomorrow, win or lose, I was going to give it everything I had. As I walked into the community center, my heart was pounding like crazy. The room was packed, and the air buzzed with tension. I could smell coffee and hear the rustle of papers as people settled in their seats. This wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the main event, and everyone had come to see the showdown. I took a deep breath and thought, well, Emily, you wanted to make a difference. Let's see if you can put your money where your mouth is. Margaret strutted in like she owned the place, her nose so high in the air I thought she might trip over her own feet. She sat down in the front row, arms crossed, looking ready to breathe fire. I remembered her first complaint about my garden, how she'd sniffed at my tomato plants and called them unsightly. Now, she was out for blood. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and cleared my throat. Margaret tried to interrupt, but the room shut her down. Let her speak, someone shouted. Mrs. Johnson, clutching her famous apple pie, nodded encouragingly. I started my presentation, showing photos of my garden and quoting the HOA rules. People actually applauded. Alex and Priya, the young couple from down the street, gave me thumbs up. I even heard a few oohs and ahs when I showed off my prize tomatoes. Margaret's face got redder with each slide. Just when I thought I was home free, Margaret jumped up, waving a piece of paper like it was the Holy Grail. I have here, she announced, her voice shrill, a new rule about gardens that was just approved by the board. The room erupted into chaos. You can't do that, yelled Mike, our mailman. In the middle of the mayhem, Mr. Peterson, the grumpiest old man in the neighborhood, stood up. The room went quiet. I move, he said in his gravelly voice, to remove Margaret Hargrove from the board. Margaret's jaw dropped so far I thought it might hit the floor. She sputtered and stammered, trying to find words, but for once in her life, she was speechless. As we waited for the vote, I realized this meeting had turned into something much bigger than my garden. It wasn't just about tomatoes and zucchini anymore. It was about fairness, about community, about standing up to bullies who hide behind rule books and regulations. The board members huddled together, whispering furiously. Margaret kept trying to butt in, but they waved her away like she was an annoying fly. Finally, the board president stood up, looking a bit shell-shocked. We'll be taking a vote on Mr. Peterson's motion, he announced. All in favor of removing Margaret Hargrove from the HOA board, please raise your hand. I held my breath as hands shot up all around the room. It was like watching a wave at a football game, except instead of cheering for touchdowns, we were cheering for the right to grow vegetables without being harassed. The vote was unanimous. Margaret was out, and my garden was safe. But that wasn't the end of the story. As I watched Margaret storm off, her face redder than my prized tomatoes, I realized something bigger was happening. This garden fiasco had sparked a neighborhood-wide conversation about community. People were talking, sharing ideas, and even planting their own gardens. Mrs. Johnson's apple pie became a symbol of neighborly love at our impromptu block parties. It turns out, sometimes it takes a little rebellion to bring people together. Who knew my zucchinis would be the catalyst for positive change? As I looked around at my smiling neighbors, I couldn't help but think this was the start of something beautiful. And hey, At least we all learned that zucchini weevils aren't a real thing. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.